Dominic Hunt had exactly 3 rules for surviving the Outer Rim cargo routes. Don't ask questions about the cargo, don't pick fights with anyone bigger than your ship, and absolutely, under no circumstances whatsoever, respond to distress signals from planets that actively wanted to kill you. Guess which rule he was about to break? His ship, a beat-up hauler called the Midnight Gossip, long story, previous owner had a sense of humor, drifted through the Kellyan sector at a pace that could generously be described as leisurely and more accurately as this thing might fall apart if we go any faster. Dominic had been humming along to some old Earth music, contemplating whether his dinner rations qualified as food or as a war crime, when the console started screaming at him. Well, not literally screaming. That would have been more pleasant, actually. Instead, it made that horrible beeping sound that meant someone, somewhere, was having a catastrophically bad day. "Oh, come on," Dominic muttered, pulling up the distress signal. The computer, which he'd never bothered naming because it had the personality of a particularly judgmental toaster, displayed the coordinates. Mothcar 6. "Absolutely not," he said to nobody in particular. "That moon is a death trap, wrapped in a nightmare with a side order of, why would anyone go there?" The computer beeped again, helpfully displaying the signal's origin. Military transponder. Dralketh designation. Now that made Dominic pause, his finger hovering over the Ignore and Proceed button. The Dralketh were the galaxy's premier badasses, 8 feet of muscle, fur, and crystalline bone structure that could shrug off weapons that would turn a human into a fine mist. They were the beings that other species hired when they needed someone to walk through a war zone and come out the other side looking bored. If the Dralketh were sending a distress signal, something had gone cosmically wrong. "Computer, what are the odds that this is a trap?" The toaster with delusions of grandeur calculated for a moment. 38% chance of hostile ambush. 62% chance of environmental hazards resulting in operator death. 0% chance of this being a good idea. "You know what I love about you? Your unfailing optimism." Dominic was already plotting the course change. His hands moved across the controls with the ease of someone who'd been flying junkers for the better part of a decade, ever since. Well, no point thinking about that now. The Midnight Gossip groaned as it changed trajectory, and Dominic could swear he felt the ship judging him. Yeah, I know. But look at it this way. If we die horribly, at least you won't have to haul another shipment of Vulcan fungus. That stuff smelled like a gym sock married a corpse. Mothcar 6 loomed larger in the viewport, a muddy brown sphere wrapped in noxious clouds that swirled with an almost malicious intent. The moon had a reputation. Atmospheres that shifted between breathable and lethal with no warning, predators that made Earth's worst nightmares look cuddly, and geological instability that meant the ground itself might decide to kill you just for variety. Tourism Board really should have worked harder on the brochure. Dominic brought the ship down through the atmosphere, his knuckles white on the controls as the hull rattled and shrieked. The sensors were going haywire, showing toxic pockets everywhere, and for a moment he genuinely questioned his life choices. "Life signs?" he asked the computer. 5. 2 adults, 3 juveniles. Dralketh biosignatures confirmed. 2 adults showing critical injuries. Juveniles in distress. Juveniles? Great. Because this situation wasn't complicated enough without kids involved, the wreckage came into view. A Dralketh military transport that had clearly had a very bad conversation with the moon's surface at high velocity. It was embedded in the side of a rocky outcropping, half submerged in what looked like a very angry river that definitely hadn't been there by choice. Debris scattered everywhere, and Dominic could see scorch marks that suggested the crash had been enthusiastic. He brought the gossip down about 100 meters away, the safest landing zone in a landscape that redefined unsafe. His environmental suit was already waiting by the airlock, and he climbed into it with practiced efficiency, running through the checks twice because dying from a faulty seal would be embarrassing even by his standards. "Maintain position," he told the computer. "If I'm not back in an hour." "File the appropriate paperwork with the Haulers Guild and sell your belongings to cover docking fees?" I was going to say, "Avenge me," but sure, let's go with the paperwork option. Really captures the spirit of adventure. The airlock hissed open, and Mothcar 6's atmosphere hit him like a punch. Even through the suit's filters, he could tell this place was hostile. The air had a greenish tint, and the ground squelched under his boots with a wetness that probably violated several health codes. The wreckage was worse up close. Metal twisted in directions metal shouldn't twist. Crystalline control panels shattered and, oh good, small fires still burning despite the moisture. Nothing said stable situation like random fires in a crashed spaceship. Then he heard it. A roar that made every primitive part of his brain scream, "Predator! Run!" Dominic crept around the wreckage until he found them. Two Dralketh adults and Holy Mother of Space. They were even more impressive in person. The female, he assumed female based on the slightly more angular bone ridges along her skull, was pinned under a support beam that must have weighed a ton. Her fur was a deep amber with black stripes, matted with blood that shimmered with an odd iridescence. The male beside her was larger, darker, with silver markings across his shoulders. That probably meant something important in Dralketh society. A piece of hull plating had him trapped from the waist down. Both of them were staring at Dominic with eyes that glowed faintly yellow, a mix of pain and something else. Hope? Desperation? Hard to read expressions on a face that could bite through steel. The female, Kesseth, he'd learn later, let out a string of sounds that his translator struggled with. Dralketh language was complex, all growls and harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't reproduce. But the translator caught the gist. Cubs, water, dying. Dominic followed their desperate gestures to what remained of the cargo bay. His blood went cold. The cargo bay was flooding, water pouring in from a crack in the hull that must have hit an underground reservoir. And in there, barely visible through the rising water and debris, were three small shapes. The cubs. They couldn't have been more than, 5 in Dralketh years? Still covered in the spotted fur pattern that juvenile Dralketh sported before their adult markings came in. They were clinging to a piece of equipment that was slowly sinking, their heads barely above water, and circling below them, drawn by the vibrations and blood in the water, were things. Insectoid creatures about the size of dogs, with too many legs and mandibles that clicked with an eagerness that made Dominic's skin crawl. Scretch. He'd heard about these things. Scavengers that hunted in packs, with venom that paralyzed their prey before they ate it. Alive. The male Dralketh, Ulgrim, was trying to move, his muscles bulging with effort that should have let him lift a building. But the debris had him pinned at an angle that even Dralketh's strength couldn't overcome. He roared again, this time with pure anguish that needed no translation. Dominic did some quick math in his head. The water was rising fast, maybe 10 minutes before those cubs went under. The Scretch were getting bolder, one of them making a test run at the smallest cub, who swatted at it with claws that weren't quite developed yet. The adults couldn't reach them, couldn't save them, which left one option. "You have got to be kidding me," Dominic said to the universe at large. The universe, characteristically, did not respond. He looked at his environmental suit's readouts. Oxygen, good for maybe 30 minutes of heavy exertion. Structural integrity, questionable at best. His own physical capabilities, human, which meant laughably inadequate by galactic standards. The Cubs let out high-pitched distress calls that hit something deep in Dominic's chest, something that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. Kids. They were kids, and they were scared, and they were going to die. "Okay," he said, moving toward the flooding cargo bay. "Okay, we're doing this. This is happening. This is definitely the stupidest thing I have done this month. And last month I tried to outdrink a Bulgarian, so that's saying something." Kesseth's eyes tracked him, widening slightly. She made a sound that the translator interpreted as a question. "Human? You?" Yeah, he got it. Humans were the galaxy's punchline. The species that somehow stumbled into space travel despite having the durability of wet paper and the survival instincts of a suicidal lemming. They weren't warriors. They weren't heroes. They were the beings that other species hired to do paperwork and maybe fix complicated machinery if they were lucky. But Dominic had exactly 0 better options and even less time. He hit the edge of the flooding cargo bay and immediately regretted every life choice that had led to this moment. The water was already waist-deep, murky with sediment and things he didn't want to identify. The temperature readout on his suit spiked. This water was hot, heated by some geothermal activity that meant it would eventually boil. Just another lovely feature of Mothcar 6. The Cubs saw him coming and their distress calls got louder. The smallest one, Tolix, though Dominic didn't know that yet, reached out with paws that already had retractable claws, the universal gesture of a child wanting to be picked up and saved. A scretch lunged from the water, and Dominic kicked it on pure instinct. His boot connected with its carapace, and the thing went flying with a screech that sounded personally offended. "Yeah, well, same to you, buddy," Dominic muttered, wading deeper. Behind him, he could hear the parents making sounds that his translator was giving up on. Shock, maybe. Disbelief. The emotional equivalent of, "What is that idiot doing?" Great question. He was still working on the answer. The first cub, Pix, the largest of the 3, was clinging to what looked like a weapons locker that was slowly tipping into the water. Dominic reached him first, and immediately understood the core problem with his brilliant rescue plan. Dralketh cubs were not small. Pix was already the size of a full-grown human teenager, maybe 120 pounds of muscle, fur, and panic. And he had claws, sharp ones, which he immediately tried to use on Dominic's suit when the strange-smelling alien got too close. "Hey, hey, kid, I'm trying to help." Dominic grabbed the cub's scruff the way he'd seen people handle cats on old Earth videos, except this cat could absolutely murder him if it wanted to. Pix thrashed, his claws scraping across Dominic's suit hard enough to trigger breach warnings. Perfect. Just perfect. Dominic did what any reasonable person would do in this situation. He held on tighter and started wading back toward solid ground, while a juvenile alien predator did his level best to shred him. The water was up to his chest now, making each step a battle against current and weight and the growing certainty that his spine was going to file a formal complaint. "You know what?" he grunted, muscles screaming. "When this is over, your parents better give me the galaxy's best thank you card. I'm thinking glitter. Maybe some of those scratch and sniff stickers." A scretch erupted from the water right next to him, mandibles wide enough to give him a very personal tour of its digestive system. Dominic twisted, using Pix as a shield, in a move that was either tactically brilliant or proof he'd completely lost his mind. The cub, enraged at this indignity, lashed out with claws that caught the scratch across its face and sent it scuttling back with a screech. "Good boy! See? We make a great team!" Dominic hauled the cub onto dry ground, where Kesseth immediately started making noises that might have been soothing if they didn't sound like a chainsaw arguing with gravel. Pix scrambled over to his mother, and Dominic didn't waste time catching his breath because, oh right, 2 more cubs still actively drowning. He turned back to the cargo bay and felt his heart sink. The water had risen another foot. The equipment the other 2 cubs were clinging to was nearly submerged, and both of them were struggling to keep their heads up. The middle cub, Hennick, was trying to hold on to her smaller brother, but her strength was fading. Dominic plunged back in, and this time the universe decided to make things interesting. The floor beneath him shifted, some piece of wreckage settling, and suddenly he was underwater, his suit's alarms shrieking about temperature and pressure and imminent death. He surfaced, gasping, tasting blood in his mouth from where he'd bitten his tongue. Something in his chest had definitely gone wrong. Ribs, maybe broken, definitely unhappy about recent management decisions. "Come on, come on!" He reached Hennick just as the equipment gave up entirely and sank. The cub went under, and Dominic dove without thinking, his hands grasping blindly until they found fur. He pulled, his legs kicking against water that felt like it was actively trying to cook him alive. They broke the surface together, Hennick coughing and terrified, her claws digging into Dominic's shoulders hard enough that he felt his suit breach in 3 places. New alarms joined the chorus of existing alarms, creating a symphony of impending doom. The Scretch were getting aggressive now, emboldened by blood in the water. His blood, from the claw marks, mixing with whatever the cubs were bleeding from minor cuts and scrapes. Dominic's plasma cutter was designed for slicing through cargo containers, not fighting off alien wildlife, but desperation made for wonderful innovation. He fired it one-handed, while holding Hennick with the other arm, the superheated beam cutting through the water and catching a Scretch mid-lunge. The thing exploded in a spray of chitin and ichor that would absolutely give him nightmares later, assuming he lived long enough for later to matter. "How's everybody doing?" he shouted to the parents, knowing they couldn't understand his specific words, but hoping the tone conveyed, "Still alive. Barely. This is fine. Everything's fine." Olgrim was making sounds that Dominic's translator kept rendering as static, mixed with what might have been prayers or curses or both. Kesseth had gone quiet, her glowing eyes tracking Dominic's every move with an intensity that suggested she was downloading his entire existence into memory for later analysis. Dominic got Hennick to shore, his vision starting to blur at the edges. The broken ribs were definitely making their opinions known, and his suit was now reporting oxygen levels that could charitably be described as optimistic. But there was still Tolix. The smallest cub was barely keeping his head above water now, his little paws scrabbling at nothing, his distress calls getting weaker. He was maybe 80 pounds, which in any sane universe would be too heavy for an injured human to carry, while wading through hostile water filled with things that wanted to eat him. Dominic had stopped being sane about 5 minutes ago. He went back in, and this time the water was deep enough that he had to swim. His ribs made persuasive arguments about why this was a terrible idea, arguments he ignored in favor of reaching the cub before physics and biology teamed up to kill them both. Tolix grabbed onto him with the desperation of someone who understood, on a primal level, that this was his last chance. Dominic got an arm under the cub and started back, except the debris had shifted again, and his exit route was blocked. Plan B. Go around. Except Plan B required swimming through a section where the scretch had gathered in numbers that suggested they'd called for backup and possibly catering. "Okay, little guy," Dominic wheezed, his free hand bringing up the plasma cutter again. "Time for you to learn why humans are either the bravest species in the galaxy or the dumbest. Honestly, it's probably both." He fired the cutter in wide arcs, creating a barrier of superheated water that made the scretch think twice about their lunch plans. It also used up the last of the cutter's charge, but who needed functional tools when you had pure, stubborn spite? Dominic kicked and pulled and dragged himself and Tolix through the water, his lungs burning, his suit now reporting critical failures in systems he didn't even know he had. The edge of the cargo bay seemed impossibly far, and for a moment, just a moment, he wondered if he'd actually miscalculated this whole rescue operation. Then Tolix made a small sound, something between a whimper and a chirp, and Dominic's brain made an executive decision. Nope, not dying today, not with a scared kid counting on him. He found the strength from somewhere. Adrenaline, stupidity, the sheer human capacity to keep going when any rational being would have quit, and hauled them both onto solid ground. Dominic collapsed. Tolix sprawled across his chest, both of them breathing hard. The cub was making confused sounds, probably wondering why this strange creature smelled like fear and determination in equal measure. Through his blurring vision, Dominic could see all three cubs safe now, huddled near their parents who were still trapped but alive. Kesseth and Ulgrim were staring at him with expressions that transcended species: shock, gratitude, and something else that looked almost like confusion. "You're welcome," Dominic managed, though it came out more like, "You're welcome," because his mouth wasn't cooperating. "Just gonna rest here for a second. Maybe a minute. Possibly forever." His suit's medical scanner was painting a picture of his internal state that could best be summarized as, "How are you still conscious?" Broken ribs, definitely. Gash on his leg he hadn't even noticed. Oxygen deprivation. Early stages of hypothermia somehow mixed with heat exhaustion, because Mothkar 6 apparently couldn't decide how it wanted to kill him. But the cubs were safe. Dominic's vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. His last conscious thought was that he really should have updated his will before taking this run. Then everything went sideways, and then went dark. Consciousness returned like a rude neighbor banging on the door at 3 a.m, unwelcome, persistent, and accompanied by pain that had opinions about everything. Dominic's eyes cracked open to the familiar ceiling of the Midnight Gossip's medical bay, which was less a bay and more a converted storage closet with delusions of grandeur. The diagnostic panel above him blinked with readings that probably meant something important to people who understood medicine beyond, "Ow, that hurts." "Welcome back to the land of the living," his ship's computer announced, with all the warmth of a tax audit. "You have been unconscious for 6 hours, 18 minutes. Your vital signs were concerning. I took the liberty of administering the entire stock of medical gel, 3 pain suppressors, and 1 very stern lecture about risk assessment that you were too unconscious to appreciate." "Thanks," Dominic croaked, his throat feeling like he'd gargled sandpaper. "Your bedside manner is exactly what I'd expect from a toaster." He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. His ribs had apparently formed a union and were currently on strike. Bandages wrapped around his torso, his leg, and parts of his arms he didn't remember injuring. The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and wet fur, which was odd, because, oh, right, the Dralketh family was on his ship. Dominic turned his head slowly, fighting vertigo, and found himself staring at 3 pairs of glowing yellow eyes at cub height. Pix, Hennick, and Tollix were pressed against the medical bay's doorway, watching him with the unblinking intensity that predators perfected and prey found deeply unsettling. "Ah," Dominic said, which was not his most eloquent opening, but seemed appropriate given the circumstances. "Hi?" The smallest cub, Tollix, made a chittering sound and took a tentative step forward. Hennick grabbed him by the scruff, holding him back with the bossy authority of a middle child everywhere. Pix just kept staring, his head tilted in a way that suggested deep thoughts were happening behind those eyes. "The juvenile Dralketh have not left this corridor since you were brought aboard," the computer reported. "The adult Dralketh are currently in the cargo hold. I have provided them with basic medical attention from the ship's emergency supplies. Their injuries are healing at a rate that defies human medical understanding, which I find both fascinating and somewhat insulting to human biology." Footsteps, heavy ones that made the deck plates vibrate, announced the arrival of said adults. Kesseth ducked through the doorway first, her amber fur now clean of blood, though Dominic could see the silvery traces of new scar tissue along her shoulder where the beam had pinned her. She moved with a slight limp that would probably be gone in another day or so, because Dralketh healing was apparently as impressive as everything else about them. Ulgrim followed, somehow making the cramped medical bay feel even smaller, just by existing in it. The male Dralketh had to hunch to avoid hitting his head on the ceiling, his broad shoulders nearly touching both walls. The silver markings on his fur seemed to shimmer in the artificial light, and his eyes, currently fixed on Dominic with unreadable intensity, glowed brighter than his mates. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The translator stayed silent. The only sound was the medical bay's equipment humming and Dominic's heartbeat doing its best impression of a drum solo. Then Kesseth made a sound, low and rumbling, that the translator finally caught. "You saved our cubs." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that seemed to contain multitudes of confusion behind it. "Yeah," Dominic said, because what else was there to say? Seemed like the thing to do. They were, drowning, scared. I had thumbs and a questionable sense of self-preservation, so— "You are human," Ulgrim cut in, his voice like gravel grinding against more gravel. The translator gave it a tone of disbelief, as if he was still trying to reconcile observable reality with everything he'd been taught. "Last time I checked, yeah." Dominic attempted a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Sorry to disappoint. I know we're not exactly the galaxy's first choice for heroic rescues. We're more the trips over own feet and accidentally discovers a new element species." Kesseth moved closer, and every instinct Dominic had screamed at him to run, which was hilarious given he could barely sit up. She lowered her head, bringing her face level with his, close enough that he could see the individual crystalline structures embedded in her skull bones, the way her pupils contracted and expanded as she studied him. "I have fought in 32 campaigns," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "I have seen warriors from 100 species demonstrate courage under fire. I have led strike teams into situations where death was certain and victory was myth." She paused, her expression doing something complex. "I have never seen what you did. You should have died. Multiple times. You should have fled." "Probably," Dominic agreed. "But then your kids would have drowned, and I've got this annoying quirk where I can't live with that kind of thing. Terrible character flaw. Really holds me back in the cutthroat world of cargo hauling." Ulgrim made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a growl, or might have been both. "You make jest." while injured. While speaking of certain death, his massive head shook slowly. This is human normal? More or less. Look, we're not built for durability. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the— Dominic gestured vaguely at the Dralketh's impressive physiology. Most capable of bench-pressing a small vehicle. So we compensate with stubbornness and really poor risk assessment. It's kind of our thing. The cubs had crept closer during this exchange, emboldened by their parents' proximity. Tolix managed to squirm free from Hennick's grip and padded right up to the medical bed, placing his oversized paws on the edge and peering at Dominic with unfiltered curiosity. Dominic, operating on instincts he didn't know he still had, reached out and scratched behind the cub's ear. Tolix made a sound like a purr crossed with a chirp, leaning into the touch. Both adult Dralketh went very still. "Ah," Dominic said, suddenly aware he might have just committed some horrible cultural taboo. "Is this not okay? Should I not?" "Our cubs do not trust easily," Keseth said quietly. "They are trained from birth to evaluate threats, to maintain distance from unknown species. Tolix has known you for hours. He should be wary." "Maybe he's just got good instincts," Dominic suggested, continuing the ear-scratching because Tolix was clearly enjoying it, and stopping seemed rude. "I mean, I did pull him out of water full of things that wanted to eat him. That probably earned me some trust points." Pix approached next, more cautiously, his young face set in an expression of serious contemplation. He sat down near the medical bed, close but not quite touching, his tail curled around his legs in a posture that Dominic suspected meant something in Dralketh body language. Hennick remained near her mother, but even she was watching Dominic with less wariness and more open fascination. "You understand what you have done?" Ulgrim asked, his tone shifting to something more formal. "By Dralketh custom, you have placed our family in debt. A life debt. 3 of them. This is not—" He struggled for words, the translator catching his frustration. "This is not a small thing." "I don't want a debt," Dominic said quickly. "Seriously, I was just helping. That's not something that needs payment or obligation or— You do not understand." Keseth's voice was patient but firm. "Among our people, such a debt shapes bloodlines, changes the course of families. You saved warrior cubs, offspring of the Keseth, and Ulgrim lineage. This will be recorded, remembered. Our cubs will carry the knowledge that a human, a species we were taught to view as weak, as lesser, did what their own parents could not." That hit differently than Dominic expected. He looked at the 3 cubs, really looked at them, and saw individuals rather than generic alien children. Pix, serious and thoughtful. Hennick, protective and careful. Tolix, curious and brave despite his size. They were kids who'd just had a traumatic experience, who'd been terrified and helpless, and saved by someone who probably looked as alien to them as they did to him. "How old are they?" he asked softly. 4 cycles, Ulgrim said. "Young enough to still be learning basic combat forms. Old enough to understand they nearly died." 4 cycles. Dominic's translator tried to convert that to human years and came up with somewhere around 6 or 8, depending on developmental markers. Babies, basically. Cubs who should have been playing and learning and definitely not drowning in toxic water while monsters circled. Something in his chest tightened, and it had nothing to do with the broken ribs. "Look," he said, meeting Keseth's eyes, then Ulgrim's. "I don't know about debts or customs or whatever. I just know that where I come from, you help kids when they're in trouble. You don't think about it. You don't weigh options. You just do it because they're kids and they deserve someone to give a damn." The translator struggled with "give a damn," eventually settling on something that approximated "provide protective concern." Keseth and Ulgrim exchanged a look, one of those wordless, spousal communications that transcended species. When Keseth turned back to Dominic, her expression had shifted into something he couldn't quite read. "Tell me about humans," she said, settling onto the floor in a posture that suggested this wasn't a casual request. Not the information in the galactic databases, not the species profile that describes you as diplomatically useful, but physically limited. Tell me what makes a human run into death for strangers. Dominic blinked. This was not where he expected this conversation to go. That's a big question. We have time. Your medical computer informs me you should not move for at minimum 12 hours. My mate and I will not leave our cubs. Our cubs will not leave you. She gestured at Tolix, who had now climbed partially onto the medical bed and was curled against Dominic's side like an oversized purring space cat. So, we have time. Speak. Dominic looked at the cubs, at the parents, at the absurdity of his situation. Trapped in his own medical bay with a family of warrior aliens who wanted to understand human nature because he'd been too stubborn to let their children die. "Okay," he said finally, "but fair warning, humans are weird, and the explanation is probably going to make us sound either really noble or really stupid." "We will judge," Ulgrim rumbled, something that might have been amusement in his tone. And so, because he had nothing better to do, and because Tolix was warm against his side, and because two of the galaxy's most formidable warriors were looking at him like he was a puzzle they desperately wanted to solve, Dominic started talking. He told them about humanity. Dominic started with the basics, which felt inadequate the moment the words left his mouth, but he pushed forward anyway. Humans are persistence hunters. That's the technical term. Back on Earth, our homeworld, we weren't the biggest predators. We weren't the fastest. We had no claws, no venom, no natural armor. He gestured at his bandaged torso. As you can see, that hasn't changed much. Pix's ears perked up, interested. Hennick had crept closer now, sitting just outside the medical bay, but clearly listening. "So, how did we survive?" Keseth asked. "We outlasted everything else." Dominic shifted carefully, mindful of his ribs. "We'd pick a target, say, an animal that could outrun us in a sprint, and we'd just follow it. For hours, sometimes days. We'd track it, chase it, never let it rest. Eventually, it would collapse from exhaustion, and we'd walk up and finish the job. We turned stubbornness into a survival strategy." Ulgrim's expression suggested he found this concept either fascinating or insane. "You hunted by refusing to stop." "Exactly. And that mentality kind of stuck with us as a species. We're really bad at knowing when to quit." Dominic scratched Tolix's head absently, the cub purring louder. "It's why we kept trying to reach space, even after the first dozen catastrophic failures. It's why we colonized worlds that actively hated us. And it's why I couldn't just ignore your distress signal, even though every logical part of my brain was screaming that it was suicide." "Illogical," Keseth said, but her tone suggested she was testing the word rather than declaring judgment. "Completely," Dominic agreed. "But here's the thing about humans. We don't survive because we're logical. We survive because we're emotional, and our emotions make us do ridiculous things like care about strangers." He paused, gathering his thoughts. This was harder to explain than he'd expected. "How did you describe humanity to beings who'd built their entire civilization on strength and combat prowess?" "Your people value warriors," he continued. "The strongest, the most skilled in battle. That's how you measure worth, right? Ulgrim nodded slowly. A Dralketh proves themselves through combat, through victory, through demonstrating superior capability. Humans measure worth differently. We value. Dominic searched for the right words. The people who refuse to abandon others. The ones who stay when it would be smarter to run. We tell stories about individuals who sacrificed everything for strangers, and those stories shape how we see ourselves. Kesseth leaned forward, her crystalline bone structures catching the light. You said you did not want a debt, yet you speak of sacrifice. These concepts seem opposed. Maybe to you, to us, helping someone isn't about creating obligation. It's just what you do, especially for kids. Dominic felt his throat tighten, memories he usually kept locked away threatening to surface. Where I come from, there's this idea that children are precious. Not just your own children, all children. They represent the future, hope, innocence, whatever. Point is, you protect them, period. No calculation, no weighing of costs. You just do it. Tollix made a sleepy sound, his breathing evening out. The little cub was falling asleep against Dominic's side, apparently deciding that the strange-smelling human was safe. Our cubs are trained to fight from the moment they can stand, Ulgrim said quietly, watching his youngest son. We teach them that strength is survival, that weakness invites death. We do not speak of hope or innocence. Maybe you should, Dominic said, surprising himself with the boldness. But he was already in this deep, might as well commit. Look, I'm not saying your way is wrong. You've built an impressive civilization. You're the warriors everyone else calls when they need protection. That's worth something. But there's more to life than just surviving through strength. Such as? Kesseth's tone was genuinely curious now, not challenging. Connection, empathy, the ability to look at someone completely different from you and still recognize their worth. Dominic glanced at the three cubs. Your kids were terrified down there, not because they were weak, but because they're young and they needed help. That's not shameful. That's just being alive. Hennick finally stepped fully into the medical bay, settling near her father but keeping her eyes on Dominic. You were scared too, she said, her voice higher pitched than her parents', the translator rendering it with a child's directness. I could smell it. Fear scent. Very strong. You're absolutely right, Dominic admitted. I was terrified. Those Scretch things wanted to eat me. The water was trying to cook me, and I was pretty sure I was going to die at least 6 different times. But you came anyway, Pix said, speaking for the first time. His voice was thoughtful, analytical. Fear did not stop you. No, because being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand danger, which is actually pretty smart. Courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what needs doing anyway. Ulgrim made a rumbling sound deep in his chest. Among Dralketh, we teach that fear is an enemy, something to conquer and eliminate. We teach that fear is information, Dominic countered. It tells you when something's dangerous. What you do with that information, that's what matters. I was scared, but your kids needed help, so fear became irrelevant. Kesseth rose and paced the small medical bay, her movements graceful despite the confined space. There is a legend among our people, she said slowly. Ancient, mostly forgotten. It speaks of a species that conquered not through superior weaponry or physical dominance, but through bonds, connections that transcended individual strength. Warriors who fought not for glory, but for those beside them. She stopped, looking at Dominic with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under analysis. We always assumed it was allegory, a teaching story about the importance of unity. What if it wasn't? Dominic suggested. What if it was about beings who genuinely cared about each other, who built strength not through individual power, but collective support? That would be— Ulgrim trailed off, searching for words. Revolutionary. It would challenge every teaching, every principle our society is built upon. Or it would expand them, Kesseth said softly. She moved to her cubs, touching each one with a tenderness that seemed at odds with her warrior bearing. I watched you carry Pix. You are half his size, injured, oxygen-deprived. By every logical measure, you should have failed. Yet, you succeeded. Because I had to, Dominic said simply. There was no other option I could live with. That reasoning makes no sense, Ulgrim stated. Welcome to humanity. We specialize in doing things that make no sense, but somehow work anyway. Dominic managed a weak grin. We're the species that looked at space, a vast, hostile void that wants to kill us, and said, yeah, but what if we went there anyway? We're the ones who see impossible odds and treat them as suggestions rather than certainties. Pix had moved closer now, settling near his sleeping brother. At the crash site, when the Scretch attacked, you used me as a shield. Yeah, sorry about that. Tactical desperation. I destroyed its face, Pix said, and there was unmistakable pride in his young voice. We fought together. We did, Dominic agreed. You were brave. All of you were. We were terrified, Hennick corrected, but there was no shame in her admission, just honesty. Being brave and being terrified aren't opposites, Dominic told her. They usually go together. The bravest person I ever knew. He stopped, the words catching. He hadn't talked about this in months. She was scared every single day, but she got up anyway. She helped people anyway. She made the galaxy a slightly less terrible place, right up until— He couldn't finish. Didn't need to. The silence that followed held understanding that transcended language. You lost someone, Kesseth said gently. Not a question. My family. Colony accident. Equipment failure. Preventable. Stupid. And permanent. Dominic stared at the ceiling, fighting the burning in his eyes. I was off-world on a supply run. By the time I got back, there was nothing to save. Just wreckage and paperwork, and the overwhelming knowledge that I hadn't been there when it mattered. The medical bay was very quiet now. Even Tolix had stilled in his sleep, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. So, when I saw your cubs drowning, Dominic continued, his voice rough, I saw every child I couldn't save before. And I thought, maybe this time, maybe this once, I could be there when it mattered, even if it killed me. Especially if it killed me, because at least then the math would balance somehow. Ulgrim moved then, crossing the medical bay in 2 massive strides. He placed one enormous paw hand on Dominic's shoulder with surprising gentleness. You are not weak, the warrior said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. You are something my people have no word for. Something we forgot existed. What's that? Someone who fights not for victory, but for others. Who carries weight not because they are strong, but because someone must. Who faces death not to prove courage, but because letting others die is unthinkable. Ulgrim's eyes glowed brighter. You are what warriors should aspire to be. Kesseth nodded. Our cubs will remember this. They will remember that a human, a species we dismissed as insignificant, taught them what true strength means. Dominic stayed with the Dralketh family for 3 more days, while his ribs finished knitting and their ship was salvaged. The cubs taught him basic Dralketh hunting calls. He taught them card games and why humans laughed when they were nervous. When they finally reached the Dralketh outpost, Ulgrim performed a ceremony that involved ritual scarring and words Dominic's translator struggled with. The gist: he was now kin of Claw, an honor so rare the station commander actually bowed. "What does this mean, practically speaking?" Dominic asked, as the family prepared to depart. "It means," Kesseth said, her cubs pressed against her sides, "that you have a family again. Across the stars, perhaps, but family nonetheless. And it means the galaxy will learn what we learned. Which is that humanity's greatest weapon is not strength or technology." She touched his shoulder gently, claws retracted. "It is the refusal to abandon those who need you, even when wisdom says to run." Tolix hugged Dominic's leg one last time before boarding their transport. As they departed, Dominic smiled. "We're still the galaxy's punchline. But now, at least one warrior family knew the truth. Sometimes the weak ones carry everyone else. And that was strength enough."